Hey Fly Tires, welcome back. I'm Matt. Thanks for stopping by the channel. Now I'm about to do a video that I've been wanting to do for a long time now, but I just kept putting it off because it's really kind of complicated. What I'm talking about is thread. So I'm going to answer 3 questions and be as straightforward and basic as I can. The first one, what's the difference between the aught and the Denier sizing system? Can be a little confusing. I'll go through that. And the second one is, what are the advantages and disadvantages of some of the thread types you'll come across out there? And third, what thread should you actually choose for the type of fly you're about to tie? Now, I did have to do a bit of planning and research when making this video, and I came across 3 pretty good sources. First, Charlie Craven has a great article from 2017 in Fly Fisherman magazine. I'll link to that in the description. And there are 2 pretty good videos out there. Tim Camisa from In the Riffle has a great one, and Brian Weiss from Fly Fishing the Ozarks, he's got a pretty good one out there too. I'll link to both of those in the description here. Okay, for the first question, what is the difference between the aught sizing system and the Denier sizing system? Now, we've been using the aught system since at least the 1930s. Basically, you've seen the 8/0 pronounced 8-aught or 6-0 or 6-aught. And recall, aught is just another word for 0. So what that really means is a 3-aught just has a decimal and 3 zeros and then a number for whatever it is you're measuring. And a 6-aught has a decimal, 6 zeros, then whatever it is you're measuring. But the bottom line for the aught system is the higher the aught number, the more leading zeros, and then the smaller it is. And one other note on the aught system is that there's no standardization between manufacturers. A Danville 8-aught is not the same as a Uni 8-aught, which is really where a lot of this confusion comes from. Now let's talk about the Denier system. So Wapsi was the first one on the scene with this really, with their UTC. So what is a Denier? Well, by definition, 1 Denier is how much 9,000 kilometers of one single silk strand weighs in grams. So imagine a silk strand, stretch it out 9,000 kilometers, which is about 100 football fields, and then wad all that up and then weigh it. It weighs 1 gram. So that's very thin. That's 1 Denier. Now, worth noting, a Denier is not a measure of the diameter or the strength of a thread or anything. It's just a measure of how much it weighs. But by and large, the higher the Denier, the thicker and the stronger the thread might be. So a 140 Denier is certainly heavier and thicker than a 70 Denier, but it's not really measuring how much stronger it is. It's just measuring that it weighs, 140 grams versus 70 grams. And also worth noting is that the aught system and the Denier system, they're not necessarily interchangeable. I mean, Danville 6-aught is exactly 70 Denier, but a Uni 8-aught is also about 70 Denier. So just one more thing that kind of adds to this thread confusion here. So that's the main difference between the Denier and the aught systems. Now let's talk about what are the advantages and disadvantages of the different types of threads. Well, it really boils down to the thread's configuration. I mean, is it flat and more like a ribbon or a silk, or is it a round diameter and more like a rope? Most threads nowadays are made out of nylon or polyester. There is some GSP, and we'll talk about that a little later. So let's talk about 2 of the most popular nylon threads out there, Danville and UTC. Both of them are made out of nylon. Both of them have a little bit of stretch to it, maybe 25 to 30% stretchiness. They'll both lay pretty flat, and they both have a kind of shiny, almost silk-like sheen to them. And both of them can be spun and corded, which I'll talk about that here in this next section where I'm going to go through 3 of the most common sizes of UTC and show you what it looks like putting these on the hook. Okay, what I'm going to start with are 3 of the most common sizes of UTC thread. I'm going to do a 70, then a 140, then a 210. And it's going to be left to right on your screen starting at the eye of the hook. This first one, this is red 70 Denier. So I'm going to just put a few wraps down, and you can see they're laying fairly flat right there. There's not a whole lot of bump on the hook, I guess. And that's the thread in its natural state. It's kind of a flat, almost ribbon-like. Now, what sometimes you might want to do is what we call cording it up. So my thread is hanging in its natural state, and I'm going to spin it clockwise, probably a dozen or so twists here with my bobbin hanging off. And now I've got a narrower diameter thread because it's kind of corded up. So there are some applications where you'll want to do this, where you'll want to spin it tighter, maybe like when you're building your heads. So this is the thread as it's corded up. There on your left, it's kind of flat, and what I'm wrapping right here is, a corded configuration. So let's go ahead and put a 1/2 inch right here. Okay, next up is a 140 denier, and this one is a green. So I'm going to just catch it in with a few wraps right here. You can see that's still pretty flat, not completely as thin as the red was because it's, twice as heavy of a thread. So again, you could let this one spin a little bit counterclockwise and flatten it out even more. So there's some fairly flat wraps, but if you wanted it corded and you wanted a narrower diameter thread, you'll spin it clockwise. And this one might take a few more turns. So let's go ahead and 1/2 inch this one right here. And then we'll move on and do the same thing with a 210 denier. Okay, now I'm going to put down some yellow. This one is 3 times as thick as that red, 70 times thicker than that green, or not 70 denier heavier than that green. And now I've got a narrow thread and a bit tighter of a cord. So there you go. You can see that. I messed that one up a little bit, but from your left to right, starting with the red, that's a 70 denier, it laying flat, and then it corded up a little bit, and then the 140 denier in the green, and then the 210 denier in the yellow. So that's it in a nutshell of how UTC is, configured and what you can do with it between the flat wraps or the corded wraps. Okay, so that was how you get your thread to either lay flat or cord up. The obvious question next is, why would you want to do either of those things? Well, if you're making a body out of your thread, you might want it to be flatter, so you'd spin it counterclockwise and get the flat lay. But if you're binding some really thick or tough materials, think elk hair or deer hair, you might want to tighten it up and really cord it up. You'll get a little bit more bind, and it's a little easier to grab those materials and hold them onto the hook. Now, another thread that has come on the scene recently is GSP, or gel-spun polyethylene. Vivus is one of the bigger manufacturers that makes GSP, so let's talk a little bit about the characteristics of a GSP thread. Well, it's very strong for its weight and diameter. It lays very flat. Both those things could be considered advantages, but it's also very slick and doesn't have much stretch to it at all. And a lot of people would consider those disadvantages. So let's take a look at putting some GSP on a hook. I've got 4 sizes here. It's a 50, 100, 150, and 200. So let's talk about some GSP, or gel-spun polyethylene. This comes in many sizes. This one is a 50, so it's a GSP 50. You can see it lays very flat. Other characteristics of this, very slick. Very slick, very strong, and very thin diameter for its strength. Now, one of the disadvantages of its slickness is it doesn't hold dubbing very well. But it's so strong, it's great for applications like spinning deer hair or just making really big, durable bass bugs or saltwater flies. And it does cord pretty well. You see it's pretty flat there at the start, and now it's pretty well corded right here. Now it will dull your scissors, it's so strong. So let's go ahead and put a whip finish right here, 2 or 3 turns, and then move on to the next size. So this was a 50. Next I'm going to do a 100. So here is a 100. You can see already that it's wider, but it's so slick it's actually hard to catch it on the hook sometimes, so it takes a little getting used to, but it also lays on pretty flat. Let's cord this one up a little bit and then see what it looks like here. We can build a good size head with this really thick, strong, or not really thick, but really strong thread right there. So let's finish this one off, and then we'll go to a 150. Now the thickest of all, which is a 200 GSP, a GSP 200. So let's see if we can lay some of this on. But there you go, from your left to right, a 50, and then a 100, and a 150, and a 200. You can see that 200 is a little bit unwieldy there, and I'd never use that. I don't tie any saltwater or bass bugs that are big enough to really have a call for it. But it's out there, and it's available for any of you big monster fly tiers. All right, so wrapping this up, to answer the question, what thread should you be using for what? Well, in a nutshell, you should probably use the smaller and thinner, lower denier for smaller flies, and then the higher denier for your bigger flies. You should probably go with a UTC or a Danville if you have a need for being able to flatten out your thread, or if you just prefer thread that you can flatten out. And then if you're spinning deer hair, maybe you want to go with a GSP. If you need something that's just going to really bind some tough material, or you're making some really big flies with a lot of material on it, the GSP, you can put a lot of wraps on without building a whole lot of bulk. Now granted, it's a little tougher to use, but in some applications, it's the best choice. So what's my final recommendation? And this is similar to, I think, what Charlie Craven and Dave Hughes mentioned, is try a few of them out. Try the UTC and Danville. Try the nylon thread and see what works for you. Try a couple of different sizes, and you'll get a feel over time of which one's going to work best. So I did that years ago, and I've kind of been using UTC for most of my flies for the last several years. And that's mainly personal preference. And one last thing, don't be afraid to use different threads on the same fly. If you're spinning deer hair but you want a different looking head, switch it up halfway through. Nothing says you can't do that if it makes the most sense. So that's it, my friends. If you sat through this long video, I hope this was helpful for some of you folks out there. I appreciate you watching. Take care. We'll see you next time.